Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mer Herosner Podcast, Season 4, Episode 9. Thank you for joining us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. And to all of you who will be listening to us on your favorite podcast platform later on, we appreciate you tuning in. It is Thursday, January 25th, 2024. I'm your host, Vic Aslanian, and as always, I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Mr. Mike Balyan, where we discuss our great Armenian history, covering different eras, topics, and people. Please hit that like button. Make sure you are subscribed and share with your friends and family. If you like what we are doing at the Mer Herosner Podcast, please consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/merherosner and become a Patreon. We have different tiers. Starts at $5, $10, $20. And if you become the $20 Patreon, Mike will come out and hang out with you as well.
Have a couple drinks.
There you go. Have a cigar. And
I'm dragging you with me.
I'm there. I'm there.
You get the two of us.
You just got to make the day 36 hours. That's all.
Well,
How you been?
I can make a couple calls.
Yeah? All right.
I'm good.
Yeah?
I need the 36-hour day too.
Yeah, we needed that break from last week.
Yeah.
We took last Thursday off. But we got a great show for you guys today. Today's episode is titled Empire's Edge, the Armenian Saga in the Ottoman Times, and our guest will be historian Armen Manuk-Khaloyan. But before we get to the show, announcements,
Yes.
as always. Yeah. So if you're watching us on YouTube, you will see a little fundraiser with Hike for Our Heroes. And we've joined them for a new project. As you all know, when I was in Armenia, I got a chance to visit Lori, the Lodi entire province. I got to travel, and I fell in love with the beauty, the nature, the people. Now, in the heart of Lodi province lies this village by the name of Marts, where it seems time has kind of stood still for like 15 years. The fundamental human right to clean water remains a distant dream to these people. It's a relentless struggle of survival. Each day is like a battle, basically, and the villagers confront the stark reality of life without a basic necessity, which is clean water. Hike for Our Heroes has embarked on a noble quest, one that promises to transform lives and rekindle hope. Their mission? To forge a new water infrastructure and the lifeline that will not only quench the thirst of Marts, but also breathe life into its fields and farms, which is the village's basically lifeline. This is more than just a project. It's a crusade to uplift a community, to turn the tide of faith. With each drop of water that will flow through the new system, we have the power to ignite a revolution in agriculture, which is the cornerstone of Marts' economy. Your support can be the catalyst for the monumental change. By donating to Hike for Our Heroes, you're not just giving water, you're nurturing life, empowering a village, and writing a new chapter in the story of Marts. So, together, let's bring this vision to life. And we ask you to donate. This is a big project, and what we're doing on part of Mer Herosner, we want to raise $10,000 from our end, and they're going to have another fundraiser on their Instagram, which you guys should follow them, Hike for Our Heroes. So we want to, we have a lot of listeners, a lot of viewers. If each person donates $100, 100 people, we're there. We can do this really fast in a heartbeat. So please consider donating. Like I said, that you should see that donation option on YouTube where you can, whatever. It doesn't have to be 100, whatever you can. We appreciate it. But, if it's 100, like I said, 100 people, we're there. It can happen so fast. So, besides that, I recently had the pleasure of meeting a wonderful human being recently by the name of Ani Papirian. Sometimes people come into your life with the most unexpected ways, and you get to learn from them what it is to give back to our community. She's an amazing person, and Ani's actually a distinguished alumni of AGBU Armen Manuk-Khaloyan in Montreal, Canada. So all our Canadian listeners and followers up there.
We have quite a bit of people up in Toronto area and Montreal.
Yeah. So this is where she completed her education. Ani then relocated to the United States, where she pursued higher education, obtaining a bachelor's degree in business administration and followed by a Juris Doctorate from Southwestern University School of Law. Why am I telling you this? For decades, she has... besides for decades having the experience of being an attorney, Ani has dedicated herself to mentoring young students in our community, aiding them in their pursuit for law degrees. Since 2009, she has been influential coach for mock trial teams at the Armenian Sisters Academy and St. Francis High School. I got to spend some time with her and learn about what she's been doing. Amazing human being. She's been involved with AGBU, Home and Man, so many programs, just giving back. And so beyond her legal career, Ani is actively contributed to the Armenian Sisters Academy as an advisory board member and a volunteer teacher where she leads an elective class for reading. This is what people do. They give back to the community. It's so important. Now, her commitment also extends to co-chairing the Armenian Sisters Academy Gala Dinner. And this gala is very important. It's going to be on February 10th, 2024 at the Glenox Anush Banquet Hall. Now, a lot of people actually don't know about Armenian Sisters Academy. It's in Montrose. It's an Armenian school. And I know from my experience, a lot of families who have kids, during COVID, post-COVID, a lot of them wanted that change. They wanted to take their kids to Armenian private schools, and there was this big influx, and even now there's a waiting list, all of them. But this school is from pre-K to 8th grade, and it's in Montrose, and a lot of people might not know about this school. That's
I've heard about it.
Yeah, so
plenty of times.
Yeah, so this event is not just a celebration, but a crucial fundraiser to support the school. This institution holds a special place in our community, offering a nurturing environment for children to learn and grow, rooted in the Armenian traditions and Christian faith. We encourage all of you who are in the local area. Let me put up the flyer real quick. This is the flyer. And what you guys can do, if you're interested, we really encourage you guys to join. This is going to be a great gala. You guys can visit asamontrose.com for more details, or you can call 818-512-3948. That's on the screen right there. We want to have our community there to support this great gala, support the school. And one of the most important things, the fundraiser also, besides helping the school, what it does is there's a lot of families who are, low income, that they help for their kids to be able to go to the school. So it's very important. It's a great event. Ani is an amazing human being. And if you guys come across her, if you talk to her, she's just a beautiful soul. You will learn so much from her. So please, if you guys are local, you're available February 10th, join this gala. Go and support. Very, very important. Let's see. What else? I think that's pretty much it as far as announcements. But yeah, so today's guest, we were introduced to Armen with our prior guest, Michael Lee Gavlik. And we got to talk, and since the last episode was about Tehlirian and the whole series and his past, we were like, this is going to be great having Armen on, because
another very vital part
it
of
kind
the
of flows
process.
with it. Yeah. So Armen is a doctoral candidate at Georgetown University, specializing in study of history. His academic pursuits are centered around Ottoman Armenian politics and society during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His scholarly contributions, which include articles in various journals and chapters in collective volumes, reflect his expertise in this field. Currently, he is engaged in the preparation for the English language edition of Solomon Tehlirian's memoir for publication. He's doing some great work. So everybody, welcome Armen. Hi, Armen. How are you?
Hi, Armen.
Hi, Vic. Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. I know it's late. You're joining us all the way from Georgetown.
Well, I'm very happy to be here.
We're going to keep you up a little bit late today, so we appreciate the fact that you decided to do this. First, when we, obviously I give a little about you, but can you, so our audience can get to know who Armen is, can you give us short background story about where you were born, where you grew up, and how you kind of fell in love with history and wanted to pursue it, because it's not something everybody wants to do. Typically it's either a lawyer or a doctor. So
so I was born in Soviet Armenia when that was still around, and our family moved to the United States right around the time of the collapse. And when I was younger, I don't think I really demonstrated too much interest in the subject of history, not as much as maybe some other subjects. I guess I really liked World War II, and maybe that was partly thanks to playing video games and things like that. But insofar as Armenian history was concerned, it was like very much a kind of just like this blank area, which I didn't know much about, except for like what you might have learned, through watching like a holiday special, or or just like watching like some sort of documentary on like the local Armenian channels in Los Angeles. Then once I started, I was just about to start college. I think like that was the time when I became a little bit more. I started demonstrating a little bit more interest in history. I can't really say where it may have begun. I think in my last year of high school, my dad got me a copy of the biography of Monte Melkonian. I think I was just so uh, taken away by like just his life story. And for people who don't know, he was an Armenian who was born in California, and in the 1960s and 1970s, he decides to, leave his studies and fight for all these organizations. And, these are militant organizations in places like in Lebanon and all these hotspots in the Middle East. And ultimately, he goes to Armenia, and in the 1990s is killed during the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. So all that, was kind of just like struck me as very fascinating that somebody could leave his life and do something like that. And I thought, okay, maybe I should be studying, or maybe, this is like my entry point for reading more about history. And so, beginning from my time as a, college student to, uh, you know, present day, like it's my interest has just like been fixated fully on it, and it's become much more um, fully developed. So even though my PhD is on Ottoman history and Ottoman Armenian history, like I really enjoy reading about Russian, Soviet history, history on Africa, and Latin America, just to kind of make me as well-rounded on, give me like a well-rounded education on the subject as anything else.
Wow. Wow.
And here you are.
Yeah.
Spark Notes version of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and here you are. Look at where you ended up with.
Well, we got some questions for you. Again, today we're going to talk about the Armenians during the Ottoman Empire and how their lives were, what their experience was from from every aspect. But before we start the questions, I want to thank everybody who's joining us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. People, feel free to comment in the chat. A lot of love for Armen. Looks like you got a lot of fans joining us. I wanted, as we're going through the show, feel free to ask questions, and we'll circle back and bring these questions on the screen for Armen. And I also kind of want to try to do a little roll call today. If you guys can type where you're from. I know, later on we get a lot more views, but even if you end up watching this later, just comment, type in. We want to know where everybody's from. I know we see the demographics, like 73 countries, but it's always good to see where people are actually, you see their name, where they're from, when they're hanging out. So yeah, just go ahead and type where you're from. Let's do a little roll call. All right, so let's go. Let's start.
So Armen, I've always been fascinated with what... I mean, of course, we're fascinated by history, right? And besides the war stories, if there's one thing Vic and I both have kind of learned is really need to understand where all this stuff started from. There's always a spawn. There's socio-economic strife, or whatever the case is, internal strife, all encompassing. We've had guests in the past who have talked about this briefly, though, not as in depth. And even I'm curious myself. And so hence why this is the first question, I guess, is can you shed some light on the socioeconomic status of Armenians during that time in the mid-19th century, early to mid-19th century, leading up to everything during the Ottoman Empire, pretty much?
Yeah, I'll try to do my best. I mean, the time period that you're asking about is a very momentous period in Ottoman history. By that point, the empire had been around for close to 5.5, maybe, about 5.5 centuries. And so there was a certain time when ruling a large multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire made a lot of sense to people at the time, and there was historians like to talk about the managing of difference. So even though you're the sovereign ruler of an empire like the Ottomans is that of the Sultan, he and maybe a good majority of his subjects happen to be Muslim. There's also the rights and privileges insofar as you can have like a right in living as a subject of a monarch. Also have to be taken care of and to be addressed, because a lot of times these people are forming the big part of your tax base when you're collecting taxes. So you have to offer them, religious, certain religious freedom, certain sort of privileges that will basically allow everyone to live happily all together. And of course, all of this has to be placed in its own context, and we have to understand like what was understood as harmony, 200, 300, 400 years ago is probably not the same thing that all of us would agree upon now. But there came a point where the Ottoman system was perceived by its leaders to have been breaking down by the late 18th century. Partly that was because the European powers like Russia and beginning with like Britain and France were asserting their own interests in parts of like the Middle East, or Russia on its border with the Caucasus, or the Crimea when it took over that region in the 18th century. It was also partly because that there were competing centers for power in different parts of the empire. So it was no longer the Sultan's writ, which basically got to decide on how to raise armies, how to raise taxes, but smaller groups of you can call them like nobles, or also known as like tax farmers, who can essentially prevent the empire's orders from Constantinople from being carried out in their particular region. So by the mid-19th century, it was decided that if we are going to address all these issues, then we have to begin to centralize the government. So in the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire begins this program called the Tanzimat, or the reorganization, which little by little allows at least like some semblance of offering some semblance of like civil rights to Ottoman subjects. I think it may not necessarily be a one-to-one ratio of seeing the exact same things like that European citizens were being offered at the time, even though like big chunks of Europe were also under the control of empires. But at the very least, there was this sort of idea that whether you're a Muslim or you're a Christian or a Jew, it shouldn't necessarily have to prevent you from occupying a position in government, for example, which may have not been possible before then. So there was this idea that at least like based on merit, you should be able to advance to these positions. So it was a good idea in theory, but how it was implemented in practice is of course like a different story. But insofar as the case of the Armenians are concerned, when that opportunity was offered to them, they embraced it wholeheartedly. And for a good 25 years, like basically until the 1870s, I think there was a lot of hope in the Armenians that through these sorts of reforms, we can centralize power, we can eliminate corruption in different institutions, like in the Armenian church, where again, you had like also small little competing centers for power, which the authorities in Constantinople were not very happy with. And so some Armenians thought we can partner with the Ottoman government so that we can begin our own set of reforms at the same time in a parallel fashion.
So from the sound of it, they were very cooperative with things. I mean, they were working with a lot of the local folks and different creeds or whatever the case is, right? It wasn't some sort of like they segregated themselves from the sound of it. I mean, anyone that we've talked to has kind of said the same thing. They were always very there was a huge high participation in everything that was going on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they saw themselves as part of the empire. So,
of course, you had no choice.
You're talking about hundreds and hundreds of or thousands of years of Armenian existence in that area. So naturally, even if you're under a different empire rule, I mean, when they were under the Byzantine rule, same thing. They were involved. They had,
but
Maharas, they had so many.
But you know how sometimes certain groups of people can, and I'm not trying to paint a negative thing to this, but can act as a thorn in the side of said empire or said control mechanism, right?
True. Especially nowadays.
Well, yeah.
So, now, in your research, obviously, you've learned so much about how all this, especially the economic role, let's say, and the contributions of Armenians. How do you see them evolved in the Ottoman Empire during this period? Are there any specific examples you can share with us of, how they were? Because we know later on it became a problem.
Yeah.
So, Can you shed some light on that from like the early 19th century going into the 20th century?
No spoiler alert, huh?
Yeah.
This is just on the economics side
Yeah,
of
like the economic role of Armenians and their contributions to the empire.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of, I think, understand this history, it's best to look at, again, what was going on in the empire more broadly. Just, again, this is like how historians like to frame it as the empire in beginning in the late 18th and early 19th century is integrated into what's known as like the world system, which basically means that you now become interconnected through trade in a way which may have not necessarily been as sophisticated, not as instantaneous in previous centuries. That different forms of trade did exist, going back at least in the region more than a millennium. But now it became such that sometimes certain countries' entire dependencies just became, or entire countries' economies just became dependent on certain crops. To see the economic reforms essentially do sort of parallel the same efforts in political liberalization that I was talking about earlier in under the Tanzimat. And to be honest, like I have not studied the economics factor too carefully, but it is this kind of question which recurs where you do see why is it that there's a sort of prominence among Armenians in the field of economics beginning in the mid 19th century and into the 20th. You have a very similar parallel, I think, with Jews in places like in Germany around the same time. And some historians may try to explain that away through like cultural reasons. So in the case of Jews, a lot of them were shunted into roles where, for example, like money lending, which would have been considered by the church authorities in Europe as something which was almost beneath them.
sin.
Yeah, usury.
Usury. So it's not necessarily something which was considered to be too prestigious position, and yet once like banks start coming to be established, once you have like these larger financial institutions being established in different parts of the world, it almost seems as if like being in that sort of position kind of lends you to
Yes.
expand on the basis of scale quite easily. And Armenians, there was quite a bit of money lenders in among Armenians in Constantinople as well. And I can't help but think that on the one hand, it is that sort of role that you kind of slip into, but it also helps that if you're going and getting an education in Europe and learning several European languages, that's going to maybe help you to start a business with certain foreign companies, for example, or to enter into contracts with them on a basis that you already know how things are perhaps done elsewhere. So that immediately gives you an in. And so once you finally return to the empire, then you can immediately try to expand your businesses in that sense. So again, it's a real good question. I feel like we as historians have not studied it in enough detail as all of us would like, but it's not, I think, too big of a grasp to think of it as, a too big giant a leap to go from smaller scale, like money lending ventures to much larger enterprises like banks. And, if you can develop like contacts with the authorities of, or like the leaders of certain countries, like the Russian Tsar or the Ottoman Sultan, or like in Germany with the German Kaisers, as like Jews do over there too, then you can kind of exploit those contacts to acquire greater privileges.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, from previous guests that we've had Umit Kurt.
He was
and
he was the
even
one who started out,
Professor Herine
Yes.
Wattenpau.
Yeah.
Her book. They all talk about how obviously we know this, but like you said, I don't think there's been enough research to maybe shed more light. But banking, any type of the gold
Medical.
industry, medical.
Yeah.
even law, all these prominent type of
They had positions in city councils. Or
leaders. They were always thriving
Yeah.
to be in that part, and you see that nowadays, even in the diaspora. You see
I
that
mean, here in LA.
yeah, LA, New York, even in Canada, it's just it's something in our nature to thrive, to be in the leadership role. But a good question is, apparently there's a story about the Bank of Ottoman.
Yeah, so the what I think that's Michael. So I think what Michael's referring to is
It is
the
Michael.
Ottoman Bank, or in French, of course, it would be Bank Ottoman. So
Yeah.
very quickly, hopefully, like this, I can place it in the same context of the question that you guys asked me. Like the Ottoman Bank is, despite its name, actually a French and British owned institution, which is founded in the 1880s. Once the Ottoman Empire under the Sultan Abdulhamid II defaults on its loans, the Europeans decide that in order to help pay off its debts, they have to take almost direct control over the country's finances. So I forget the exact statistic, but I think close to 80%, or maybe no, it's probably less than that, but I think it was maybe close to like 40 or 50% of the revenues that the Ottoman Bank was collecting on behalf of like the all the citizens of the Ottoman Empire was going just to debt servicing. So a massive chunk of it was being directed in that, directed toward that purpose. And again, without trying to go too off topic, like it's becomes a very famous because in the late 1890s, Armenians seized the bank because of its prominence, because of its visibility in this very nice neighborhood in Istanbul, that they tried to use its capture as a way of like drawing attention to the plight of Armenians who were being massacred by Abdulhamid right
I've
around
heard
the
of
same
this
time.
story. I've heard of this story.
So
Yeah.
have I. See, these are the type of things that are really, really fascinating because you can really relate to what's going on today.
Yeah. Well, that
in
system is
multiple-
the oldest trick in the book.
Yeah,
Which is,
well, of course,
we see that happening with other countries
course.
now, to seize, especially in the financial aspect of it. It's interesting, but maybe we'll do one episode just about that bank and just go really into the details. It's a very interesting story of how they seized it and everything. It went on for a few. I don't know how many days it was, but maybe I don't know if again I don't know the full story, but I know it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, it's worth diving into when we get to that point in the timeline. Okay, so we've covered somewhat, a little glimpse of socio-economic, also economic and whatnot. How about on the religious side of things? With like the Armenian communities, what was the situation like? I mean, considering the Ottoman Empire was vastly Muslim, right? And then you also mentioned that there were Jews living amongst them, Christians living amongst them, and I'm sure whatever else. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what was their religious identity? Like, what was it? How was that influenced on a daily?
Well, religion, for sure, even well into the mid 19th century, well into the early 20th century, as well structured the lives of many people in the empire. When you had an institution like the Armenian Church, which had its tradition, the Armenian apostolic tradition at that time went back almost 2 millennia, so it could draw on a whole set of cultural reference points, like holidays, like its saints and martyrs, like its literature and public holidays, which were very interestingly enough celebrated sometimes with Muslims as well. It depended on which part of the empire you were talking about, but it wasn't very unusual to have Christians, Muslims, and even Jews like taking part in each other's religious holidays. And that was because of the nature of the Ottoman Empire too, which was founded at least nominally as a empire which is governed by Islamic laws, and so according to that framing, Christians and Jews are considered protected peoples, so they're afforded are supposed to be afforded their religious rights. And well into the 19th century, I don't think people had any objections to seeing the church as their representative. I mean, whether you were living in Islam or if you were living in like a small town or village in the eastern provinces where most of the Armenians resided, the village priest was somebody who was considered like a local figure of authority, and you would attend church on Sunday, if not on other days as well. And again, that helped kind of form this sort of cohesiveness to a community. But the Armenian church also, very interestingly enough, we've come to understand in the mid 19th century, accepts its role as a partner to the Ottoman Empire. And so Hrimian Hayrik, Mkirtich Hrimian, who very famously among Armenians, we know as the person who gives the speech about the iron ladle, 20 years earlier, 10, 20 years before that speech in 1878, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's in 1878, it might have been in 1881, but, is sent to Van province to help the Armenian church root out corruption among like the local prelacies, to root out corrupt priests in order to offer the local population a much clearer line of contact with the capital, so that any petitions or any questions that that people have can immediately be addressed, and issues that they are having can also find an immediate remedy. So it's very interesting to kind of see the church evolving and also settling into this new role as the time goes by. And in the years immediately before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, I think you also see the Armenian church trying to reconcile itself in life once this empire is now governed by a parliament and a constitution. Well, how do you do that when you also have like political parties who are vying for electoral power, and if they want to use a church, is that considered a proper venue for electioneering? And there's in my research, I've come across a lot of letters and telegrams from the Armenian church in Echmiadzin, which is telling its subordinate Constantinople, we can't allow this to happen because then it's overly politicizing our roles and institutions. It's very fascinating just to see these different ways that people see religion as a way of bettering their community. And another example you can also give is how, even though the Armenian church may have like its own prelacies in like the Russian Empire, oftentimes you have Armenians collecting donations in the Armenian church for causes such as donations for Armenian victims of the massacres, or if there's famine, that they also collect quite a bit of money for it. And again, the institutions like the church were perhaps the best conduits to allow you to do that.
Fascinating. Yeah. It really is. That, like, I mean, again, I'm drawing parallels to the modern day, but you see some of the tactics used, especially during election cycles, whether state or federal. You see a lot of the same type of things being used. It's just fascinating to hear about that in that time period.
I mean, also faith, the faith, the Christianity, people, especially back then, more, I think, looked at church as like that hub, the safe space. It was
above and beyond anything else.
So I think drawn to them to be able to do these type of fundraisings or whatnot, I think was a no-brainer for them, right? It was like, okay, this is our spiritual leaders. This is what it's all about, humanity. So kind of go through them. Now, being Armenian, one of the things that I personally love, and I know most Armenians love, is our traditions. We have some great traditions, values in our families, the way we raise our kids, and these are things that have been passed down through centuries, but were there any significant cultural practices or traditions unique to the Armenian communities during this era of the Empire that you might have come across during your research that that people might not know about, something that we it's not maybe practiced anymore, it's not really, it's kind of died out? Is there anything unique traditions just for the Ottoman Armenians?
I mean, if I can just think of maybe one example off the top of my head. I mean, I mentioned a little bit earlier about like this sort of public quality to religion. So I mentioned that during celebrations for like you were in Jerusalem, again, it wasn't out of the ordinary for Muslims to go to like Easter or to congratulate their Christian neighbors for Easter. And I remember seeing an example in Yerzinkar, Erzincan, in what's now like central Turkey, that there was um, the remnants, or not the remnants, but uh, there was the fragments of certain Armenian saints which were kept in a reliquary, or the relics. So the relics is the
Yeah.
word that I was trying to remember. That was held inside a reliquary in a Armenian church. And very interestingly enough, it wasn't just Armenians who would go next to these relics to um, be healed from their powers, because there was this sort of spiritual and supernatural significance that was attached to the relics of holy men. But it was also Muslim women who would, for example, go inside the Armenian church, and they would also sit by it, thinking that if they were suffering from a certain ailment or disease, that they would also be cured by it, because it has these sort of special healing powers.
Yeah.
I mean, this is very interesting, and it's like very much like a part of the world where I don't want to say like necessarily secularization was the one thing which changed everybody's minds, but it was this thing which had been handed down for generations, and you can go back into Christian tradition from 1,000 years ago, where you see that appear much more prominently, especially when it comes to like relics and things like that. But like just in terms of like a cultural tradition, I mean, I think that's like one which springs to mind immediately. Of course, there was like other things which have like the feast days that the Armenian Church has, where you celebrate um, uh, like Vartavad, which is like the
Yeah.
transfiguration
Hmm.
of Christ. But then like
Vartavar predates,
Yeah.
also
yeah.
Christianity. So, yeah, there's a lot of that. My question was more like, is there certain something like they did, like let's say a practice or like even a feast type of it? There's something that after the genocide, kind of like it almost faded away or got lost because of the spread of Armenians through the diaspora. Obviously, we've kept most of our traditions,
Yeah.
the prominent one, but something like that, the Ottomans. You try to picture and imagine, like Armenians living during that era, and you try to, when you close your eyes, you're like, you want to hear the music that
Yeah.
was being played, the sounds of the streets, the dialect that they were speaking. So that's where my question was for. Was there anything unique as far as the type of traditions practice that you might have come across your research? And if you haven't, that's fine. I just thought I ask you.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've looked too carefully at that in the course of my research, but I would say that maybe, and again, this might be simplifying things. I think there was, a certain sort of simplicity to the way that people understood things until the modern world kind of caught up with the Ottoman Empire. Once you had like the building of railroads and development of technology like telegraph and uh, faster forms of communication, and also like new ideas which were appearing in the late 19th century, new ideas on race, on and nation and belonging. I think it sort of made things a lot more complicated, because things then had to uh, had to conform to a certain way that political or national leaders might want to see them play out. Now, it's a very, again, like very condensed way of kind of putting that, but I'm always struck, I think, like just like how much simpler that like almost as if like people were a little bit more naive about like the world, the world of things until they really did change.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about the family structure? What was it like for families to hold on to their traditions, or what was their structures like? Were they impacted by anything? To your knowledge, during or with other ethnic groups, was there influences or anything of the sort that may or may not have altered, let's say, the Armenian family structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the more rural provinces, like it was still very much like a patriarchal
Yeah.
society. So a lot of regimentation based on your gender and your role. So women usually were the ones who were in charge of the household, whereas the men were the ones who were either, tilling the farmland or, managing a small business or a store or something like that. Um, One of my chapters looks at the love life of Daniel Varujan and his wife, and you kind of see
Hmm.
like this very vivid example of how he's trying to buck those trends by the early 20th century. Varujan goes and receives an education in Belgium and lives there for a couple years and comes back with a university education and ultimately falls in love with one of his students. And it's very interesting to kind of see like the dynamic play out between him and his wife over the next few months because his wife, before she was even born, was promised to the son of another family,
Yeah.
and they are living in a town called Sivas, which is also now in central Turkey. And um, his wife, whose name is Araksi, her parents are absolutely dead set against the fact that their daughter wants to uh, marry Varujan, and they concoct these different idea like plots. Like, well, Varujan and his wife, first they think like maybe we should elope because this will be a lot easier than if we were to stay here. His future wife's family tries to introduce like a different suitor, anything to just kind of like throw a wrench into their works.
Relationship.
And
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, and it's very interesting that the entire city of Sivas, or like all the Armenians of Sivas, kind of come out on one side or the other, and it's very interesting because you see the social dynamics at play. According to like some of the sources I've read, the families which have been much more well established, who are like considered like the big land owning elites and classes and business owners, are very much on the side of Araxi's parents. So they are the traditional elite and they don't want things to be ruffled too much. And the whole idea of, I think, like marrying somebody you love was very foreign, I think, at that time, and not just among Armenians, but I think in the Ottoman Empire more generally. And then, interestingly enough, the subset of society which comes out in support of Varajan are like the new cultural elites, like people who have received education, people who are educators or lawyers or doctors, like the professional class that's coming uh, into shape at that
Hmm.
time. And ultimately, Autoxy's parents relent and they do get married, but you can see how, like, just the very idea that they would kind of approach the subject of like forming a relationship based on just like mutual feelings was very new at the time. And Autoxy herself, I think she comes under her husband's influence in a good way, where she asserts herself as like an individual who has her own separate thoughts, has like something to say about it, and really gets into these heated arguments with her parents because of how disdainful she is for their old ways. And so a lot of this also kind of, I think, speaks to
Interesting.
like the education which Varujan received in Europe, which informs his way of approaching like his relationship with a woman in this way. So that's like one real interesting example, I think, we can conceive of just like
Yeah.
Yeah.
family or gender relations at the time.
Well, I mean, the fascinating part about, like you said, Araxia was promised before she was born to somebody else. I mean, talk about old traditions, right?
Literally
Old
took the words
ways.
right out of my
Like
mouth,
that's
man. Yeah.
oh my god, I can't even imagine that. It's like how like. But
We've
that's
talked about some weird things in previous episodes.
Before we move on to the next question, I want to again thank everybody who's joining us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. We are joined with historian Armen Manuk-Khaloyan. We're talking about the Armenians during the Ottoman Empire. But there's a question. David has a good question. You want to read that? It's pretty
says,
interesting.
I'd love to hear Armen's thoughts and knowledge regarding the relationship and interactions between the different Ottoman Armenians in cities/villages.
The relations between Armenians in different towns and villages.
Maybe I know you. Maybe if I'm correct, earlier on he mentioned how in like different provinces,
depending on
depending on what part of the empire, right, where there was maybe a more concentration of Armenians.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I wonder if I've ever really even thought about it along those lines. I think, again, after 1915, after the genocide, I think we almost kind of took it for granted that Armenians may have seemed to have thought and spoke alike before the war and before the genocide just completely upended things. Whereas I wonder if there may have been a certain sort of pride in your local town or your local region because of certain traditions. I think you can kind of imagine like somebody from Sasun, for example, where it's like this, or from Zeytun, where it's like these martial traditions which they draw their traditions from, like which go back several centuries by the 19th century, and they can kind of take pride in something like that, and maybe like assert themselves as well. We're a little bit more. We have this martial tradition which we can definitely place us on a level above like other Armenians, whereas maybe Armenians in especially like in Constantinople or in Smyrna, which are these massive urban centers, I think you would have like this sort of a different attitude where
the elite attitude, right?
We're university educated, or we are a professional class, or we are part of that very wealthy class of elites, so that it's only thanks to our generosity that maybe some of the provinces are even able to build their schools or to essentially make a living. I mean, again, that may have been a huge exaggeration on their part too, but I think that's where you do see some sort of I think like some level of relations between people from different areas, which go beyond the simple fact of like, let's say, trade between regions, or maybe you attending the church of of a neighbor from like another village. I think it's maybe best seen through like a class lens, and how you have, for example, a lot of rural Armenians coming from rural provinces to work as porters and laborers in Constantinople, and how you read the accounts. A lot of them are just like boarded into small domiciles where like maybe 8 or 10 people just like live in one particular area. So it's like this very, very much like secluded from like the other elites, I think, if you were to just like view it through that lens. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm very glad that David's here too. Him and I went on a study abroad trip to Armenia in 2007, so I'm glad that he's here.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think especially during time of peace, if you can call a small era during that time, you got the Sasuntis who are, they have that pride of being those warriors. You got the Hamshitis, you got so many different regions, and it's everybody had their own kind of like thing. I don't know what you want to go, identity, I guess, and maybe there was some parts where they looked down upon one another, or and I don't know if it was more looked down upon. It's more of that pride, I think, right? Everybody had their pride. Maybe the Armenians from Antap were different, but I think and you see that even today, I think, with the regions of within Armenia. You have the Sunnic region, you have the northern province like Lori, or eastern, western.
Well,
Yerevan is, like you said, Yerevan is like that that more of that elite,
Rome.
Rome.
Yeah.
But one thing we know that during crisis, all that stuff goes
Oh
out the
yeah, of
window,
course.
and it's about unity. It doesn't matter which part. And I think, unfortunately, during the genocide, because of lack of communication, because of lack of technology, the message didn't get
Sure, it
there
wasn't
in
going to get there
time
on time.
till it was late. And I think that was one of the big, and the Turks, if, at least from in my opinion, they did a really good job trying to minimize for the word to get around for the different regions.
Well, I mean, again, it had to be well thought out.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
wasn't just like they woke up in the morning and decided
Yeah.
to do what they did.
you know, obviously nationalism played a significant role shaping the late 19th and 20th century. How did Armenian nationalism manifest during this period, and what impact did it have overall with the relationship in the Ottoman Empire with the Ottoman elites or government?
That's a very good question. I'm going to try to do my best to answer it. Nationalism is also probably a word that may be easily misunderstood because it sounds, I mean, maybe in first glance, like the definition itself is very simple, but there's different kind of strands of nationalism. There is this sort of civic nationalism, which I think may be better put as like patriotism, hayanasidutun in Armenian, which is a love of
Mm-hmm.
homeland, a love for fatherland, which is very much a kind of like a recent idea, relatively speaking. It's something which kind of, which kind of originates in the late 18th century with the French Revolution of 1789. This whole idea that or even here in the United States, the idea of like the 13 colonies
Mm-hmm.
banding together, almost revolutionary to no pun intended. Like somebody from Boston can relate to somebody in living in Virginia or in Charleston and decide to band together to form a much larger like territorial entity. So it was very much a novel idea once these ideas, once they started to make inroads into Ottoman Empire itself, because as I mentioned a little bit earlier, whereas previously religion was maybe this key, what we would call like national marker to one's identity at the time, now nationalists who were usually intellectuals, but it's not exclusively made up of them, try to propose like new definitions. And these definitions were always contested. They were almost never settled. Arguably, they still are not settled. And regardless of the fact, if you're looking at Armenian nationalism, Greek nationalism, even Turkish nationalism, all of those sorts have like similar ways of thinking, but not everybody can agree on the definition. So, um, beginning in the 19th century, you have once like Armenian nationalism appears, it's in a guise of maybe everybody speaking a particular language. So even that question itself was like very much contentious in the mid 19th century. There are Armenians one subset of Armenians who were saying that, well, we should be speaking classical Armenian, Grapar.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another subset of Armenians who were saying, well, it's too challenging for our greater part of our population. So we should be speaking the vernacular form of our language. Well, then, somebody else would even say, well, should we be speaking the Constantinople dialect? So that's just like the question. That's just like how even a question of language can become so complicated. But then ultimately, religion can play a huge role. And one of the most interesting examples I've come across is the case of these Armenians who live in these very scattered parts of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. They're known in Armenian as the High Horom, which translates into Armenian Chalcedonians. So these are Armenians who belong to the Greek Orthodox Church, which is, of course, is on a theologically different doctrinal level than the Armenian Church, and yet these Armenians continue to speak Armenian. They're the descendants of Armenians who converted to Greek Orthodoxy during the Byzantine times, so more than a
Yeah.
millennium earlier. And these Armenians are seen as potential members of like the greater, wider Armenian nation. So whereas up until the 20th century, until the Ottoman Empire's collapse, that is, the Ottoman census was based on counting people by the religion that they belonged to rather than by the language they spoke or how they self-identified. Armenians were saying, well, these people should be included within our nation. It's very interesting that you hear them say that, because Greeks in the modern state of Greece, which is founded in 1832, are also looking at these Armenians and are saying, well, no, they're Greeks. They just happen to be the descendants of the ancient Greeks from 2,000 years ago. So you kind of see this sort of contest over people taking place throughout the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Very fascinatingly, you can also go to the archives in Armenian in Yerevan today, and you can look up church records, for example, which show Muslim Kurds and Turks who, having lived in Armenian towns in villages for decades and worked there, petitioned the Armenian church and petitioned the Russian Empire, because this part of Armenia was under Russian control at the time, to convert to Armenian apostolicism, to essentially leave their religion and be incorporated into the Armenian community that they've been living in. So it's very interesting how these, what we call like borders to national identity, were very porous, very permeable. You can enter and you can go as you please. I mean, again, a little simplification, but there was that certain quality to it. And I think after World War I and after the genocide, suddenly I think that level of that ability to choose to speak like a certain language or to belong to a certain religion is circumscribed. So a big number of Armenians in places like in Bitlis and thereabouts, for example, spoke Turkish, whereas like after the genocide, now Turkish becomes associated with the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, and it's shunned, and it's publicly shamed. So it's, or you are publicly shamed to be speaking. But again, it's very interesting to kind of see that sort of value attached to language, religion, and other things after that event, rather than when empires were still very much the key way of organizing political power in before World War One.
Yeah, the map changed. Excuse me. It's really interesting to think about it too. And again, I'm constantly drawing parallels to today.
Yeah.
Right. Because I mean, we live in such an area or a country where you have so many different people from so many different places. Everybody's fine with whatever what creed, what language, whatever. But now he's painting such a detailed picture of what it was like back then. It's super, and you're constantly drawing parallels to it,
Yeah, it's like this kind of almost the same thing, but just a different part of the world.
It was pretty much the same thing.
But same kind of mindset. Yeah. So interesting. Wow.
Have you come across especially with what you just talked about, have you come across a lot of misconceptions, let's say, with the Armenians and their way of life in that time period? And if you have, what are some of them? I'm curious about this too.
Well, I mean, the answer to your question is definitely yes. I think once you study the history by looking at archival documents are in the form of letters, of diaries, of petitions, which are sent to and from different organizations or entities. It could be a petition from Armenians in a certain village to the Sultan. It could be a petition to the Armenian Catholicos in Echmiadzin, for example. Once you kind of like get to that sort of ground level of research, which, to be honest, has not really been done until about 15, 20 years ago, at least like in American academia. Armenians in Soviet Armenia actually did a pretty good job of mining material in the archives, but oftentimes the way that they would present it would be in a very sort of description, or like it had like a very little explanatory or analytical quality to it. But I think one thing that I've come to discover just like in the course of my research, which is a way of kind of like dispelling a myth is, of course, like or the official Turkish historical thesis at years earlier, and I think even to the present, they always said that Armenians wanted independence, and that's why they revolted during the First World War to get their own state. Whereas uh, have when I've been doing my own research, I've come to realize that the Armenians not only did not want their own separate state by 1913, 1914, but that they were very happy with living in an empire, but they had like an extra caveat to it. As I've come to understand in my research, I think the way that they would have explained it is that why should we settle for a small state, located in this economically depressed region
Yeah.
of what's now the eastern part of Turkey, when we can have our own empire? So the idea is that having become prosperous, but also having become the most educated and uh, leading, uh, having acquired like the sort of education, established contacts with like foreign countries, we should also be able to acquire like positions of power in government, like prime minister, like the minister of finance, like the ministry of all these important portfolios in Ottoman government, because only then we'll be able to literally and figuratively find a common tongue to speak with our European neighbors,
Mhm.
so that we'll be able to kind of hold off like further European intervention, but at the same time we'll also be able to improve the empire's position vis-a-vis economics, vis-a-vis our own internal development. So I think that's like the one thing which I've only really dawned on me about a year ago, but I was coming across that sort of rhetoric more and more in the sources that I was reading, like in diaries and in documents, where on the one hand it's maybe this sort of frustration with how little is accomplished under the ruling governments in the early 20th century, and how if only they had the ability to
Hmm.
run things, then things would be on a completely different level.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a very interesting point because again, throughout every historical narrative, it's always that like you said, the Armenians were going to revolt. There was also the Russian
Yeah.
side involved.
Yeah.
But like you said, I mean, it makes sense because again, drawing parallels to today, if you're in the United States and let's say, you have this community of Armenians that are prospering and they have high
Yeah.
positions in every type of, whatever you want to call it, in politics, business, so forth. And you see this empire that's thriving. Why would you want to separate yourself from that, almost like become an island, and then you got to
Well,
start from zero, you got to start trade, your own police, and this and that.
let's not forget, this wasn't their fault. It wasn't like groups of people started to rise up.
No, but the point I was trying to make, that now kind of tying that with the question I had about the ultra nationalism, was there a certain group or that kind of maybe wanted that, and there was a strife between, let's say, these more of the elite Armenians who were like, no, we're doing great, we're in this, we're in high position and so forth. Is there any ties to that nationalism versus that misconception that we're talking about, that they was, they wanted to separate and have their own state?
I think there may have been disagreements among members of the Armenian political elite and among, I guess you can call I mean, there was this sort of disenchanted group of Armenians who, for one reason or another, became so frustrated with the the pace of things in the Ottoman Empire that they were willing to kind of write it off. And you have those examples in different parts of the world too. In Austria-Hungary, which is an empire which is host to different ethnic groups. There are, for example, Czechs, people who've now formed modern Czechoslovakia's population, who are very frustrated with the idea that they do not have as much rights as German speakers or Hungarian speakers in that empire. So when World War One breaks out, they actively collaborate with allied governments in order to help obtain independence for a separate Czechoslovak state. So I wouldn't surprise me too much to hear that sort of like voices in the wilderness in the Armenian setting. There's a lot of Armenians who leave the Ottoman Empire for Russia, maybe some for the United States just before the war breaks out. And some of them may be expressing the view that, the age of empires is ultimately coming to an end. It's giving way to this idea of a nation state, and the nation state is so much more exclusive in terms of its ownership. It's mainly based on the fact that there's like a ruling ethnic group, as its name implies. But I think those voices, at least in the Armenian case, are kind of in the minority. I think, and just because, again, the whole idea of like empire is so much more widely accepted than the idea of like separate nation states, even though you have more of those, appearing like every decade or so. Especially like in the Balkans, you have like first Greece and then Serbia and then Romania and then Bulgaria, which are former subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but throughout the 19th century ultimately gained their independence. But in places like in Central and Eastern Europe, or like in the greater part of Russia, again, it seems like empire is still the way to run things. But I think for like you can read, for example, the Diary of Krikor Zohrab, who is an Armenian member of parliament in November 1914, when the Ottoman Empire finally enters the war. And you can see that he is mourning the death of an empire, as he himself says. And he says, like, my heart grieves for what lies in store for the fate of these people. And
Yeah.
on the one sense, it's like this recognition that this war is going to devastate the people because it's on a scale which nobody's ever seen before. But it's also very tragic because Zohrab himself is um, murdered on the orders of his very close friend, was the equivalent of the prime minister of the empire at the time, Talat Pasha. Well, it's not the prime minister, he's the interior minister, but you can see how those hopes are just like so cruelly dashed during the war. The people, like the greatest, as Zohrab himself asks, like where are the empire's true believers? Because he doesn't consider Talat or Enver Pasha, like the members of the CUP who are in charge of government at the time, as the true believers of an empire. Because if they were to maintain the empire according to his logic, they wouldn't be taking this massive gamble by going into a war when the empire is not ready for it. And again, it's a very interesting way that he and others were kind of conceiving it at the time.
Yeah, yeah. David brings up a good question, and I'll throw it. But Mike has to, unfortunately, go. He's going to draw his second yellow card and leave early. Unfortunately,
I've had
but we're going to
do
continue.
Last couple Thursday nights.
Yeah. But we'll continue. So, Mike, you can exit,
ladies and gentlemen.
We'll continue our conversation.
I'm sure I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, buddy. Have a good game. Get those goals. All right, so as Mike leaves, we're going to continue with our conversation. But David had a good. It's more of a thought. He wanted to know your thoughts about the rise of the CUP, since we kind of touched up on Talat Pasha and the Ottoman Empire and the Armenians' reactions during this initial stage of the revolution. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah. So those of you guys who don't know who or what the CUP is, it's an underground organization that's founded in the late 1880s, in 1889, if I'm not mistaken. And they form an oppositional group to the Sultan of the empire at the time, Abdul Hamid II. So if you look at the social background and origins of the members who formed the CUP, they come typically from two different sorts of two different institutions from the empire. One is from the medical faculty and from Istanbul's medical college, and the other comes from the army. But the vast majority of them are low-ranking officers. So these are people who have received an education, a certain higher education, and have come to realize that the empire is in dire straits, even in the 1880s, in the 1890s, that it's hemorrhaging territories, that it's being mismanaged, it's run by a despotic, autocratic ruler. And for about 10, 15 years, this organization kind of remains in this sort of embryonic stage. It forms cells in different parts of the empire, but where it really develops a foothold is in the city of Salonika, or now Thessaloniki in Greece, but at the time was part of the empire. And in 1908, in July 1908, there's this realization that the Sultan is going to move on these conspirators. So for about 10, 15 years, they haven't been able to weaken the power of the Sultan uh, until this moment. And so they realize they're going to march onto uh, Constantinople, which is what they do. The army units begin advancing, and at the sight of it, Abdul Hamid immediately capitulates and restores a constitution and a parliament that the empire had established in the 1870s. And the members of the CUP think that they have to save the empire from collapse. The way that they can save it is, I think, in this very limited sense. They never rule out violence as an instrument for power. Oftentimes, during this period from 1908 to 1914, they murder their own opponents. They murder journalists. They are even though they try to pretend that they are willing to work within this constitutional framework, you see that they occupy this sort of hardline position in the empire that we have to centralize. We can't allow, minorities to have their own say in how affairs are governed in the provinces. Like everything has to kind of be subjugated to the whims of the central government in Istanbul. And so I think if you look at that sort of group of people, they come from like this sort of background where they don't really care about I think like history or culture too much. I mean,
Yeah.
they that is not, I think for them, they recognize that it's brute force which ultimately wins wars. You can't pay attention to, let's say, international law, because as far as they're concerned, the European powers abuse those international laws in order to obtain benefits from the empire. The only thing that they really learn is that it's violence and force which will allow them to secure um, their their rights vis-a-vis the European powers. And again, you can take a look at like Enver, you can take a look at Talat. These are people who Enver comes from, military college. Talat himself is a telegraph clerk who within 10 years is springboarded into a position of the interior minister, arguably the most powerful position in the empire. I think for them, like all these niceties, all these ways of kind of running an empire were just secondary to them. I mean, they wanted to preserve what was left, but it was with the recognition that it would have to come at the expense of Greeks, mainly Greeks and Armenians, and who I think, were convinced were their greatest rivals. That if you were to allow things to continue apace, then probably the Greeks and Armenians were going to overtake you. And
Yeah.
again,
Become the majority. Almost.
not be the majority, but at least they will be able to take control of the reins of
I mean, like
government and
in the
power.
government, majority in the government. That's what I
Yeah,
meant.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 I think that's why even the genocide takes place. It's elimination of a potential rival
Yeah.
that they saw in like Armenians. It wasn't enough to murder the Armenians, but it had to be taken to like the
The
extra
ultimate
level
level.
of
Yeah.
confiscating their property, destroying their cultural institutions and their leaders, and even erasing their cultural heritage, because that's just one less thing that they would be able to claim as legitimating their rights in the country.
Yeah. So if you erase everything, there's no history, there's no identity, there's no proof of that they ever existed. If there was any, it'd be like the ancient Egyptians, right? That someone talks about them like they were if they existed or not. So, but yeah, no, it's fascinating how that all took place. Like you said, like Talat springboarding from his position to that. It's fascinating how fast that happened, right? And obviously you are working on the memoir for Solomon Tehlirian, and obviously our introduction was through Michael and what he's doing, and we're definitely going to some way be involved in helping to bring the story. But do you want to maybe talk about a little bit of how you got involved in Solomon's story, and what you're working on, what we can expect, and because obviously, Solomon is such a big part of this history, everything that took place in the Ottoman Empire, especially after the genocide.
Yeah, I'll provide again a very condensed version of it.
Yeah.
I met Michael in Los Angeles at the local Armenian bookstore at April, and just through a 10-15 minute long conversation, I came to understand that he was interested in presenting Tehlirian's life story in the medium of film. So I agreed to work as his consultant on this project, and it expanded from this idea uh, of just presenting this of making a film production to also translating the memoir, which was undertaken by a professional translator, Ishkhan Jimbashian, who did a wonderful job in bringing Tehlirian's memoir to life. And Tehlirian's memoir is a very fascinating document for a historian, and I think it's one of the best memoirs to appear from the people who, the last Ottoman generation, which Tehlirian belonged to, where he is so uh, aware of and conscious of the world around him. His memoir begins in Serbia, which is where his father and his uncle were living at the time of the outbreak of the First World War, and he travels from there to Russia so that he can enroll in the Russian these volunteer battalions, which are fighting alongside the Russian army. And then his memoir, goes through talks about like his tribulations, discovering his family's death during the genocide, and his pursuit of Talat Pasha, which culminates in Berlin with him assassinating him, and him later being acquitted for the murder or the assassination. So it's a very fascinating document because it, I think, is so aware of like what's going on around the world at the time. And in order to do it proper justice, I'm co-authoring the introduction of the memoir with two very prominent World War One historians, Jay Winter and Robert Gerwarth, and we're trying to present Tehlirian in this different context where I think his life has become so mythologized that it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the fact from the fictional elements of it. But we're trying to also place Tehlirian in this early 20th century world of empires, of him being a very seasoned World War One infantryman, which immediately makes him an eligible candidate to take part in this special hit squad, which takes out systematically the members of the CUP after the war.
Yeah.
And how that translates into the silver screen, I think, is like very challenging because you can watch any number of movies and TV shows which are period pieces, and how well they're able to capture that is a question of like how much effort is put into authenticity and accuracy. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to, like, my role in it is just like saying this is how I've come to understand like things playing out in the sources. And,
Yeah.
it's up to you to see like whether that's included in the story or not. But yeah, it's
I think why one of the reasons why I was drawn to Michael's idea of what he's doing, what he wants to do, is because I believe, and I've mentioned this many times in the podcast, that storytelling is one thing. I believe that storytelling is so important in our culture. to the masses, to the world in English. But also, see, these stories, if you look at certain historical piece movies, right, they try to fit an entire life in 2 hours, max 3 hours, because, obviously the viewer is going to fall asleep after a while. So there's so many movies that, like Alexander the Great, or you can name so many that it obviously puts in the bullet points of their life, right? But this story is so important, and so many other stories. I mean, we can go back even to tell stories about many kings and queens and warriors we've had. I think trying to fit that in a 2 hour movie, it doesn't do justice. So it has to be told in a series and multiple seasons. And if you tell the story the right way, if in those specific moments, like you said, like him being a seasoned soldier, right? Showing that and talking about it for the viewer to understand is so important. So I'm a big believer that any of these stories, and it could be any character, has to be told in a long form for the audience, especially the fact that this is a true event. This is a real person, right? It's not fiction. So the world who's going to watch this can understand and appreciate what took place, what happened, and why it happened. Because end of the day, this is also a tragic story, But yeah, it's. I'm so glad that you're part of this. You're in the short amount of time that I've gotten to know you and learn about you, and the knowledge you have, especially in this era, is so fascinating. And one of the questions I have, I know you got to go. It's late over there as well. I know we try to keep it about an hour and a half. So I wanted to ask you, can you share your insights and how the historical experience of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire have shaped the modern Armenian identity, and especially in this contemporary society that we live in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is inevitable. I mean, these sort of massive traumatic experiences come to define peoples and follow them long afterward. You can look at how the shadow of the Holocaust follows Jews, to this very day, and I'm sure that a lot of people refuse to accept their label as as a victim, but there's that sort of uh, sense that having been victimized previously, it almost seems to sort of anticipate your future actions, or governs so much of your thinking. I think Armenians would, because of, again, the genocide's comprehensiveness, because it encompassed more than just, again, as we said, murder. It also had, confiscation of your property, of your wealth, almost destroy, as we would call it, like this destruction of your memory. Of even being able to remember it is so hard nowadays. It comes to almost define you, and it also seems to place you in this sort of frame of mind that it's now difficult to think about in any other term except that traumatic experience. Again, I think it's not necessarily us trying to come up with this sort of nostalgia for empire. We also want to remember and memorialize like how Armenians lived before, the genocide itself. So I'm not saying that we are necessarily living with this sort of victims uh, uh, complex or something along those lines, but uh, you have to kind of like go beyond the sort of narratives and stories that we were told, especially those narratives which kind of come to shape public discourse and how we talk about things with one another, to uh, see like what was really different, like, or have things always really been this way, or are they kind of like recent innovations or recent ways of kind of thinking about it? If that answers your question, I'm not sure if
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
getting
I mean,
clear.
it does in a way, and you talked about the victim complex. It's I think that I don't know if it's a victim. maybe it is a victim complex, but it's more about the fact that till this day that and this is not about other countries recognize, and they have, and we're grateful for that. It's the fact that the people who did this to us till this day are denying it. So that I think that pain is so strong and carries through generations and generations, and I think that's where that feeling of victimhood comes in. But we also, as Armenians, I think we can't let that be our the flag that we carry with us. It's we need to figure out a way how to use it for our advantage and move forward. Never forget, still make sure that, I don't think Armenians will ever give up the fight until Turkey itself, accepts what was done to us, and for them to stop falsifying our own history, their own history, which is itself like, it's like, okay, that was the Ottoman Empire. It's not Turkey now, but it seems like they're even with their current leaders and their sister countries, they're continuing the same kind of system, which is that hatred towards Armenians.
I mean, that's because those continuities were kind of built into the DNA of today's modern Republic of Turkey. There's historians who've done research and demonstrated that even though the CUP dissolved as a organization with, alongside the empire, many of its members went on to occupy very important positions in um, the new Republic of Turkey. And so it stood to reason that these individuals would be very disinclined to be reminded of the crimes they may have been implicated in,
Yeah.
and that they would do their best to sort of blot out that history. And to a certain degree, they've been very successful in it. And you can just imagine how things were 25 years ago without, like, access to Wikipedia and social media, which has like revolutionized the way that we access information. It was so much more limited at that time, and I can understand like where that uh, impulse to order, churches to be demolished, or history books to be published and distorted in this way, or textbooks to be written in a way where you're educating your populace with a very specific. It's not just the way that you're telling the history, but like what sort of message are you imparting to them? You're
Yeah.
telling them that we were backstabbed during the war, and because of that, we cannot rely on anybody else. Definitely not the minorities in our country, but like we can't even rely on Europe or America. Like Turkey carves its own path toward, establishing itself. That's something which historians have argued has really guided Turkish leaders from its very founding to the present day.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very true. Very true. Um, David has another question for you. He was asking, I don't know if you can see it in chat. It says, in remembrance of Hrant Dink's assassination 17 years ago this month, how does Armen feel about his legacy and imprint in Turkish society and politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, Hrant Dink's death sent shockwaves in Turkey in 2007. This was this moment where you did see, massive numbers of Turks show up in public demonstrations, because they were so shocked by his death. And there was this moment that, and you can hear from many Turks who immediately afterward, that was like the one inciting incident which forced them to try to come to grips with the country's past. Now, when I come to think of it, it's like, as David says, it's been 17 years. His memory has kind of faded away, and especially in modern Turkish political culture today, like it really does not figure at all. They never really, they carried out some investigations and put some people on trial, including the gunman. But as everybody knew at the time as well. This wasn't just one guy who's motivated by
Hatred, yeah,
whether
yeah.
yeah, it wasn't one gun, sold one gunman theory, but like there was probably institutions, whether it's the intelligence agencies or the military or politics, or political leaders. I mean, it was something which clearly had a conspiratorial tone to it. Now you think about it, you do wonder, in that time span, how much has Turkey changed, and has it really changed for the better? Has it backslid under now President Erdogan's last 20 years in power? You wonder if that progress has kind of been rolled back since then. It's a very sobering question, to be honest, and I can't say if things will necessarily get any better in the future, which is again a very disheartening thing to say.
Yeah, you see the the way Erdogan is leading the country. It's kind of almost like they're going backwards instead of forward. It's very disheartening seeing that. It's sad for the Turkish people themselves. They themselves have to come one day when that shock hits them that their own history was falsified. It's gonna happen one way or another. You can't keep hiding this. But I know it's late for you. It's past midnight. But I want to thank everybody who's joined us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. We had a great conversation. I have one last question for you, and this question is: if you had a time machine, what period of Armenian history would wanna? I know you love, you specialize in the Ottoman Empire, but was there a time period you would love to go witness if we were able to give you a time machine, and why?
Maybe, I don't know. I guess I would like to be transported back to like 10th or 11th century Constantinople, and of course, this is a time when there was still a more or less independent Armenian kingdom. So there's a lot of interactions between Armenia, like very famously, the current dome of the Hagia Sophia Cathedral uh, um,
The
suffers a
Byzantine era,
earthquake.
yeah,
Yeah, in 989, suffers an earthquake, and it's an Armenian architect who's invited
yeah,
to come redesign the new dome,
yeah,
which is stood after all these years. So it's this interesting period, I guess, of like Byzantine prosperity, and within a century, that's when also the empire comes under the attack of uh, the Seljuk Turks and other
yeah,
Turkic tribes. And so I
yeah.
don't know. It's obviously,
Abbasids and yeah,
yeah, the Abbasids were kind of like were not a major political player in the region at that time, but yeah, I guess it was a little. I mean, I wouldn't want to be like fighting an army or anything like that.
yeah, yeah. Well, during that
But
time,
I
it
guess,
was, but the Bagratuni reign was kind of taking charge.
yeah, yeah.
During
When
the
Ani becomes a very
yeah, yeah.
massive, sprawling city.
Yeah, we just
With
finished that whole era with the Bagratunis, so we're prepping to go into the Cilician Armenian kingdom. So that's coming soon. But is there anything you want to share, announce anything special that you're working on and also where can people follow you?
No big announcements on my end, but I am active on Twitter, and that's when I occasionally like offer my takes on mainly on history related stuff. I don't comment too much on politics because it's not really my specialty. But like occasionally, if I ever see something, like a bad historical take, I'm like, oh, this is a moment for me to correct it, or maybe I might share like photos or something like that just to give people like an idea of like how things looked in the past, and
Yeah,
it's meant to be different. Oh well, as Michael mentioned, I guess yeah, it even slipped my mind. I'm teaching a class this semester at Georgetown, and the class is something which I designed, which was approved by our program, and the class is based on or is centered on World War I in the Middle East and in Europe. And so every week with my students, we just read a different set of articles and primary sources, like contemporary documents, that is, and we explore a particular theme, like humanitarianism, like the Paris Peace Conference talks after the war, and yeah, it's going pretty well. My students are very bright and they're very eager and they're very fascinated by this period, and I have like read occasionally stuff about Armenians too. So I'm
Wow,
glad
that's
like we're
great. That's
getting them
great.
to know this history through this channel.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. It's very important, and you know, the more you educate the other cultures about our history and what took place, it's very important. So we are thankful to you. We are thankful for Michael introducing us to you, and I want to thank you for doing this so late. It means a lot to us. And next time you're in LA, we're gonna do this live and go deeper into it. I know this was kind of like scratching the surface. There's so much we need to discuss in detail, but we wanted to kind of again, we have a lot of surprises coming up, and we wanted to kind of scratch the surface of the Ottoman Empire and the Armenians that lived there. But we're going to do a lot more in detail and have you back on as a guest.
Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. You have enjoy go get some sleep, and I know you got to wake up early. So again, thank you, and have a great night.
Good night.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All right, everyone. That was Armen, who is a very, very amazing young historian who is doing great work for the Armenian community, and we are proud of him. And I want to thank everybody who joined us live tonight on YouTube, Facebook, and X. Thank everyone who was in the chat, who the questions. We love the fact that you guys are engaging with our guests, with us. We appreciate you joining us. If you guys want to follow us on Instagram, it's at Mer Herosner. If you guys want to support the show, you guys see that little QR code on the corner that takes you to our Patreon page. You guys can support us there by becoming a Patreon. It helps the show. What else? And if you see that little sculpture right here of Kaj Vartan Mamikonian, the Great Warrior, you guys can go to our website, which is merherosner.com, and purchase there. We also have many other sculptures. We have the new sculpture of Haik Nahapet coming soon. It is in production. As soon as it's ready, as I mentioned before, all the proceeds from that is going to go to Hike for Our Heroes. So, and that's going to help with the other fundraiser we're doing. So again, guys, please help us with the fundraiser on YouTube. You should see it. It says Hike for Our Heroes. This is the water infrastructure project that is going to help, this little village in Lori, which hasn't had a water system for over 15 years. It's a dire situation. So this is what we're working on. And the goal is to do these type of small projects. This project's going to cost between maybe $10,000 to $30,000. We're trying to raise 10 on our part to help these villages to, it's a basic necessity, water. So please go ahead and support this great organization, Hike for Our Heroes. And we have a lot more announcements coming up. We have a major announcements coming up with Michael. So we're very, very excited. Besides that, again, thank you for joining us. We have a very special show next week. The two gentlemen who are holding up the resistance in Jerusalem at Cow's Garden will be joining us live from Jerusalem. We're going to have a very, very interesting conversation. So we encourage everybody to join us live next Thursday, 7:30 p.m. We'll announce it on Instagram once everything's ready for next week. Besides that, thank you for joining us today. As we always say at the end of every show, respect one another, love one another. Until the next episode, take care of yourselves.